Sometimes in the Ferris wheel, we like to take little tours around the world to see how classic rock ticks and influences the world at large. Today, we explore India's influence on rock. India has been the source of great fascination for the Western world ever since Alexander the Great. Its culture and its people have influenced many aspects of Western societies across the centuries, be it in literature, politics, philosophy, etc. Although we will explore mostly the musical side of all this, one cannot ignore the wide-ranging impact this had on so many facets of our culture. First, a little history. Although Indian classical music is one of the most ancient forms ranging almost 2,000 years, its impact on Western music is relatively recent. This is due in part to the fact that it uses a completely different system and a conception of music that is borderline alien to some Westerners. It uses a much more complex system of scales, with parent scales and descendant families that sound very different from each other. In Western music, there are only two sets of pitch ratio between the notes, one for the major scales and the other for the minor scales. Indian classical music, on the other hand, does not follow this type of division of notes. Instead, it uses different pitch ratios for the notes in different scales. The Indian music is thus based on melody or single notes played in a specific order. The Western music, on the contrary, is based on harmony that uses tonic progression and counterpoint abundantly. Western music has standardized writing notation, meaning you have to play exactly as it is written. This might explain why classical music was very reticent for a long time to incorporate Indian melodies and instrument to its repertoire. One can trace the beginning of the dialogue between the two musical cultures more clearly starting in the 1920s, when jazz giants like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong would perform in places like Afghanistan and India, which were at that time burgeoning hotspots for an Eastern jazz fan. You might wonder, why in the world would people like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong go to India, Afghanistan, and some of these Asian countries back in the 20s? Well, you have to remember, the United States at that time had rampant racism, and every time they would navigate through the different states, they would have to face this hatred at every turn. Thus, African Americans often felt much more welcome and safe in India, and this would go on for a lot of decades. This actually got even more important in the 50s. Jazz was also promoted strongly in India, in part due to the Cold War. Russia and the United States exposed India to what they perceived to be their greatest art, so as to win their allegiance. While the Russians sent the Kirov Ballet, now we call them the Mariinsky Ballet, on a cross-country tour, Americans were intent on making jazz the object of India's affection and obsessions. So they would send people like Dave Brubeck, who was one of the first musicians to be chosen by the CIA to tour, and as a result he started to jam with many local musicians. This in turn led to Indians who might not have expanded beyond their traditional comfort zone to experiment with these new concepts, which, funnily enough, were very Indian in a way because it was based on improvisation. Since there was already a musical dialogue established between India and Western musician, the arrival of rock in the 60s was almost an organic evolution. The 60s were a period where you saw Indian-inspired fashion and heard Indian-inspired music pretty much everywhere you went in London. The term for this embracing of Indian culture is Indomania. It was more than just sitars and psychedelic rock, and it wasn't just superficial, like let's say throwing a sitar in a rock song. I mean, it did happen in some of the songs, but the one name that pops more than any other in that period is Ravi Shankar, who's now known as the godfather of world music. Although he toured many countries, including the US in the 50s, his influence didn't really hit the mainstream until the following decade. Sure, some rock bands just took the sitar and threw it into a pop song as a novelty, just to follow trends, but there were musicians like George Harrison who learned to play the sitar and took lessons from Ravi Shankar. George Harrison actually fell in love with India and was life-changing for him. His music from the late 60s and beyond would not have been the same had he not come into contact with Indian culture. That being said, the height of it is really when the Beatles all travel in February 1968 with their wives and girlfriends to go to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's Transcendental Meditation course. They had met him 6 months earlier in London, and they went to a training retreat in Wales, but they wanted to go a little deeper. Other people that joined him on this course were Donovan, Jenny Boyd, Mia Farrow, Mike Love, and Paul Horn. They wrote actually a couple of songs while in India. The Monterey Pop Festival became the first really big mainstream performance of Ravi Shankar, although, like I said, it wasn't his first performance on American ground. He was the first Indian to compose music for non-Indian films, breaking through and crossing over worldwide. He does perform at the Monterey Pop Festival, but he also performed at Woodstock on Friday, August 15, 1969, when he was joined with the Indian religious teacher Swami Satchidananda, who gave the opening speech for the festival. There was also an American instrument manufacturer, Dun Electro, who introduced and manufactured the electric sitar in the late 60s, and it was used in many rock songs. It was meant to make it easier, even more accessible for Western musicians to incorporate the sitar sound in their music. Sitar is not actually an easy instrument to master, and the electric sitar combines the familiar form factor of the guitar with the twangy sound of the sitar. The very first electric sitar was manufactured at about 1968, and one of the most famous players is Steve Howe of Yes. Now that I've set up this little history, let's explore really the impact on songs that you can go and listen to. The first one I will mention is See My Friends, which came out in 1965 by the Kinks. And it's one of the first ones. It's maybe not necessarily the first one, but it's the first one I was able to find. Ray Davies was inspired by a stopover in Bombay, now Mumbai, and it actually broke through the pop charts. It actually reached number 10 in the UK. It was followed a little later in that year by Heart Full of Soul by the Yardbirds. And the one that gets a lot of airplay now, still on the radio, is not the sitar version, but there is a version where you hear it. There's usually the fuzz guitar version that you hear, but it was written by Graham Goldman, who would later be part in 10cc, and it was the first single released after Jeff Beck replaced Eric Clapton. So it's a rather important song. Of course, the first one that comes to most people's mind, especially if we say 1965, is Norwegian Wood, that was off Rubber Soul by the Beatles. So John Lennon and Paul McCartney were inspired by Bob Dylan and George Harrison, who were inspired by Ravi Shankar. George Harrison played the sitar in this song. It's a marriage of folk and raga, which is a musical style in India, and it's inspired quite a few people, both in the UK and the US, to pick up this instrument and start including it in their song. This is actually the beginning of the sitar in Beatles song. It's not the last one. It's going to come up quite a lot in the other albums. A year later, in 1966, there's Sunshine Superman by Donovan. It was his biggest hit. It reached number 1 in the US, number 2 in the UK, and many people regard it as the anthem of the summer of 1966. The album of the same name featured other psychedelic songs and had instruments like the sitar, the tambura, and the tabla. One of the good examples is Three Kingfishers, which is a great example of what would become raga rock. Another Beatles-inspired song that a lot of people think of that came out in 1966 is Tomorrow Never Knows. It's from Revolver, and this one is a John Lennon composition, but it's Harrison who's playing the sitar and the tambura, and it's actually a very beautiful song, and you have a lot of psychedelic instrumentation that's coming up with John Lennon's vocals, and he uses an artificial double tracking system, which made the songs really interesting. So if you have a little time and you have it on your playlist, go listen, and the tape loops that are used really as an instrument. So it's a really revolutionary song that not that many people know. You also have, from the same album of Revolver, Love You Too, which is one of the 3 George Harrison compositions on the album. And you can really see the Indian influences going to the next level in this one. His goal was really to showcase the sitar, and it was a revelation to a lot of people of what you could do with this instrument. Then in the same year, you have the Stones coming in with Painted Black. So this is from the Aftermath album. What makes this song unique is that it's the first song featuring a sitar to go number 1 in the UK. Brian Jones wanted to try something a bit different rather than the usual guitar, and he incorporated the musical sitar with the influence of Harirar Rao. So he studied sitar with him, and he sat with Ravi Shankar as well. So this is a lot of cross-pollination, which goes to show that like we said in some of our previous shows, the Beatles and the Stones were not actually enemies, they were good friends, and this is actually a very good example of this musical cross-pollination collaboration. You have another song, 8 Miles High, Why by the Byrds, that comes out this 1966. The former was the A side of the single, and the latter is the B side of the single. Both songs are really important if you're into psychedelic rock. Again, like George Harrison, David Crosby was inspired by Ravi Shankar. He's also inspired by John Coltrane, because jazz still is a major influence in the 60s, and Indian music is really strong in jazz at this point. You also have song Paper Sun that comes out a year later by Traffic. It's their first single, actually. The song was written by Jim Capaldi and Steve Winwood. It reached number 5 in the UK. Again, it's the sitar that you hear played by David Mason that makes this music really out there. This would not be the last time that they used it in a Traffic song, but it's the first time where you really hear their psychedelic song and their sound that will really come to be representative of the late 60s. Another one of their songs is also Hole in My Shoe. This single actually charted higher than the previous one. It reached number 2 in the UK and number 1 in Ireland. Again, it's a song by David Mason. In 67, now you have Sgt. Pepper that comes out, and Within You, Without You is one of those songs by George Harrison that really captures the imagination of a lot of people. Beside the sitar, you hear Dilruba and tabla music in the back. Some critics thought the song was pretentious. I don't think so, really. It's really a matter of being open-minded to this new mashup of sound that was maybe very alien to the critics back in the day. Also in 67, you have San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear a Flower in Your Hair that comes out by Scott McKenzie. The song is actually written by John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas, who was a friend with Scott McKenzie. And the song was used to promote the Monterey Pop Festival that we mentioned a little earlier. Very strong influence there. You have White Summer that comes out in the same year by the Yardbirds. The song was written by Jimmy Page, was heavily influenced by Indian and Arabic music along with Irish folk music. This song would also be performed by Led Zeppelin at concerts. This song would inspire Black Mountain Side and Over the Hills and Far Away. So it's a rather important song, even if you haven't heard it. Sometimes there are these songs in history that will have a huge impact within the musical community, but not necessarily everybody knows them. So it's very interesting. You also have Monterey that comes out in 67 with Eric Burden and the Animals. This song uses the electric sitar that we mentioned. The song is about the band's experience at the Monterey Pop Festival, which the Animals performed at. It's rather trippy when you hear it, and it's very poetic. Again, very inspired by George Harrison and what he was doing. And there's a cover of Painted Black on the same album, so it goes to show everything was in everything back in the day. You also have Gumper in 1967, that's off their Satanic Majesty's Request. And Brian Jones' tune. He plays more than 8 instruments on this song, so it's a really interesting bit of experimentation. You also have I Was Made to Love Her, that was made by Stevie Wonder the same year, so again, 67. The hit single was released when he was only 17. He's very innovative. He's one of the first Americans to use the electric sitar in a sound that's not necessarily pure rock, but the song peaked at number 2, so it was really popular. The only reason it didn't peak at number 1, it was kept from that spot by the Doors' Light My Fire, so it goes to show it had a huge impact. You also have the same year Axis Bold as Love. That's not so much Indian-inspired album by its music. It's more the cover, where you have Jimi Hendrix, Noel Redding, and Mitch Mitchell as forms of the Hindu god Vishnu superimposed on religious artwork. Actually, it was a very controversial album, which the band didn't really know about because it wasn't really their decision. And in India, it actually caused a very big scandal because, well, frankly, they're appropriating images of their gods. So you can only imagine what it created in terms of reaction. But it goes to show at this point, labels are starting to pick up on the fact that Indian music is really in the air and people are really having a great time listening to it. 1 year later in 68, you have The Inner Light that comes out, written by George Harrison. It was the B-side to Lady Madonna. The lyrics were inspired by a poem from the Tao Te Ching and has this feeling of a meditation song. In 68, you also have Hum by the Moody Blues that comes out from In Search of the Lost Chord. And it has obvious inspiration from the mantra of Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. So the hum that you hear a lot in the back, and you also hear some tabla being played. So it's starting to be much more organic at this point. It's not so much this sound that's coming in that nobody knows. It's much more included into the music. You also have Sit with the Guru that comes out in 68 by the Strawberry Alarm Clock. So now we're in really pure 60s vibe. This is one of the most poppy sounding songs in the entire list that I've given you. Ironically, it talks about meditation and polytheism, but it's very, very popish. And you hear quite a lot of sitars, especially towards the end. You have in 68 Gurdy Man that comes out with Donovan, and he's actually writing and releasing this song while in India. The song reached number 5 in the US, number 4 in the UK, so it had a really big impact on a lot of musicians and of the public. On the song, you hear tambura and psychedelic distorted guitars, so it's really psychedelia at its peak. There's also Carpet Man that comes out in 1968 by The Fifth Dimension. The sitar appears about halfway through the song. Again, though, it reaches number 29 in the US, number 3 in Canada. So another album that was really big in 68. Mood Raga by the Byrds also is one of those songs that is quite revolutionary because the way it's using sound, some people think it's a precursor to electronic music. So it might be worth your time if you're into electronic music as well as classic rock. This could be a very interesting tune to seek. Sound Asleep by the Turtles uses a sitar. There's also The Way, which is by a group called July. If you like early Pink Floyd, you're going to like this kind of music. There's also Across the Universe that comes out a year later in 69. So the song was written by John Lennon and has, again, sitar played by George Harrison. You also hear some tambura. This is Lennon at his lyrical experimental peak, and it gives a tune that's really incredibly moving. At the same year, you have Black Mountainside that comes out by Led Zeppelin. It's an instrumental piece more than anything else, and it's inspired not only by Indian classical music, but by Celtic folk, so you're starting to have big crossovers at this point. 69, you also have Tommy, which is Pete Townshend really is using teachings of Meher Baba, an Indian mystic and a spiritual master, really going at it and trying to find a way to translate it into music. And it gave an album that so many people think is one of their best. There's also in 69, I'll Go Alone by Humble Pie, which is a song written by Peter Frampton. There's a tabla on this one, but it's one of the favorite tracks that most people think of when they think of this album. There's also My Sweet Lord by George Harrison that comes out in 70. This song praises the Hindu god Krishna. At this point, George Harrison is converted to Hinduism. He sings really not only his love for his new faith, but he's actually trying to make it relatable to people who don't necessarily share it. So he's trying to bring in Judaism and Christianity in it with hallelujahs in the song. So it's a really interesting bit of experimentation. The song actually went number 1 in many different countries around the world, including Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, the UK, and the US. In 70, you also have Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours. You may be wondering why I'm including this one in the list. It uses an electric sitar. So at this point, we're really getting into the point where it's getting into the music and bringing in a new sound. You have Jumping Jack Flash that comes out the same year, which is originally by the Rolling Stones, but is covered by Ananda Shankar, which is a nephew of Ravi Shankar. And he covers it with Light My Fire by The Doors. He also covers Metamorphosis and a bunch of others. And it actually is a very interesting album. Not maybe really well remembered today, but it's worth your time if you want to have a better understanding. The really big album in the early 70s also is Baba O'Reilly by The Who. It was supposed to be a concept album that never really materialized, but the song is one of the most recognizable by the group. Again, the intro of the song is inspired by the synthesizers used in a different album, but it's all the influences that they're feeling at this point that are now put in one album. You also have Siberian Kratu by Yes that comes out in 72. This song was on the album Close to the Edge. You have electric sitars and an electric sitar solo. So really at this point, complete integration. You have Do It Again in 72 by Steely Dan, Tales from the Topographic Ocean 73 by Yes, that are heavily influenced again by not only Indian music, but Indian philosophy. It's a really good read if you read about the Tales from Topographic Ocean and the influence of Indian philosophy on the group at this point. It's quite interesting. You also have in 73, I Know What I Like, In Your Wardrobe, which is the first charting single by Genesis, which makes it to number 21 on the UK chart. The electric sitar begins about 35 seconds in, and you can hear it throughout the song, so really interesting. Same year, 73, Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth by George Harrison. This is his second number 1 in the US. Again, it's a religious song in theme. There's no sitar actually in this song, but this is a religious theme to it, and Hinduism means quite a lot to George Harrison at this point. I think we can include it into our list. By the mid-70s, you have Chrome Sitar by T-Rex. It's in the intro of the song and it can be heard throughout. In the credits, though, it does not say who played the sitar, which is rather interesting. You also have in 76 Wild Mountain Honey by Steve Miller Band, the Steve Howe album in 79 that uses a Dan Electro choral sitar guitar. In 79, we have Rory Gallagher from the album Top Priority. The song's Philby, and it's about a double agent from the British and the Soviets. It's really interesting that this entire thing that was actually almost started by the Secret Service ends its peak influence by talking about the two secret services. You will hear of Indian music influences in the 80s, 90s, 2000, all the way here. You can think, for example, of the Butterfield Blues Band. You have Big Star, who has India Song, REM, Beck. The Chemical Brothers, for example, Setting Sun, will have some Indian influences in their repertoire. It's not as prevalent as in the late 60s, early 70s. To this day, actually, though, we can still hear some of it. For example, a lot of hip-hop, like Loop Guru, Fundamental, Asian Dub Foundation, Talvin Singh, Transglobal Underground, Flying Lotus, and quite a few others are still including quite a lot of Indian musical influences in their music. It's just not as much in the mainstream as it used to be. So I hope this little trip through India's influence on classic rock has been interesting. I really urge you to go and use either your vinyl records or whatever streaming service you use to try to go and find out about all these songs that I've talked about. And I urge you to open your mind to it. It will be an interesting trip. This was Stephen Wheeler for the Ferris Wheels Travel Logs.